What just happened inside Windsor Castle is the moment royal commentators have been waiting 25 years to talk about. Because if the whispers are even half true, then this wasn't a simple portrait being moved. This was a long, simmering emotional eruption finally breaking through the marble silence of a palace that has spent decades pretending nothing was ever wrong. It starts with something almost too quiet to notice: a painting. A portrait of Princess Diana that was never given its rightful place. Not lost, not destroyed, just hidden, tucked away like a secret that someone powerful never wanted looked at too closely. For over 20 years, it allegedly sat in storage inside Windsor Castle, while above it all, the Hall of Matriarchs remained incomplete, like a wall deliberately missing its most emotionally charged piece. And then the story shifts, not with noise, with intention. Because insiders now whisper about William, no longer the grieving boy behind the coffin, but a man shaped by decades of restrained fire. The same William who reportedly watched how his mother's presence slowly evaporated from the very spaces she once filled with life. Flowers gone, rooms sealed, memories boxed, not erased in one dramatic moment, but gradually, almost clinically, until absence became policy. And at the center of that silence, Camilla's name keeps surfacing like a shadow that refuses to stay buried. Stories circulate of her early years inside the palace after Diana's death, how spaces were rearranged, how objects were removed, how presence itself seemed to shift in ways that felt less like mourning and more like replacement. Some call it coincidence, others call it something far more deliberate. But the real tension begins when William finally stops being just the observer. Because according to palace chatter, this wasn't impulsive. This was studied. Years of watching, years of waiting, years of understanding exactly how the institution bends and where it refuses to break. And quietly, almost obsessively, he begins mapping the rules, not breaking them, never breaking them, but learning them so well that they become a weapon no one sees coming. And somewhere in this long, silent buildup, Princess Anne enters the picture not as decoration, not as support, but as something colder, sharper. A figure who allegedly carried her own history of resentment, old wounds that never fully healed, especially around the way Camilla's presence reshaped emotional fault lines inside the royal structure. No public confrontation, no visible feud, just decades of unspoken tension sitting under polite protocol like a live wire. Then comes the move. The portrait. That single object becomes the center of everything. Because moving it is not just placement, it is positioning memory itself. And William, according to these whispers, ensures every rule is followed so perfectly that refusal becomes impossible. No loophole, no procedural escape, just institutional inevitability. The night before it happens, the story tightens like a noose. A private call. William and Anne. Reportedly brief, almost clinical, but loaded with something heavier than words. No dramatic speeches, no emotional collapse, just recognition. The kind that only comes when two people have been thinking the same forbidden thought for too long. Diana deserves to come home. And with that, everything allegedly locks into motion. The next day is engineered like silence with intent. Camilla is scheduled away from Windsor, coincidence or careful timing depending on who you ask. Staff movements become restricted, access narrowed, communication reduced to the minimum necessary to avoid suspicion. Inside the castle, something unusual begins to form. A kind of controlled hush, the feeling that the building itself is holding its breath. Then it happens. The portrait arrives, carefully wrapped, carried through corridors that have witnessed centuries of royal history, but never quite this kind of emotional gravity. Witnesses describe the handling not as routine, but reverent, almost hesitant, like everyone involved understands they are participating in something that cannot be undone once completed. Princess Anne is there, not observing from afar, not delegating, present, direct, insisting, according to whispers, on being part of the placement itself, as if this moment belongs to her as much as anyone else. And when the wrapping finally comes off, it is said the room changes. Because Diana is no longer absent in theory, she is visually back in the institution that once defined her, standing in portrait form where she had been denied for decades, not in isolation, not hidden, but aligned beside Queen Elizabeth as if history itself is being corrected in real time. No speeches, no announcement, just silence. Heavy silence. The kind that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels loaded. And somewhere in that silence, Anne reportedly speaks, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a tone that carries carries too much weight to ignore. Something along the lines of recognition, of return, of belonging finally being acknowledged after years of institutional hesitation. But what no one says out loud is even louder, because while the portrait now stands in place, the question hanging over everything is not what was done, but what happens next when the rest of the palace wakes up and realizes what has already been decided without them. And that is where part 1 ends. Right at the moment where silence inside Windsor Castle stops being peace and starts feeling like the calm before something much bigger reacts. The next morning doesn't arrive like a normal day inside Windsor Castle. It arrives like something already decided, something already irreversible, something that doesn't ask permission anymore. Camilla returns expecting routine. That's the detail insiders keep circling back to, because it makes everything that follows feel even more destabilizing. A normal entrance into a system that has already shifted without her. She steps back into a space that on the surface still looks familiar, but the atmosphere tells a different story. Something has changed in the weight of the building itself. The silence feels arranged. The timing feels calculated. Even the air, according to whispers, feels different, as if the palace has already moved on without informing her she's been outpaced. And then she hears it. Not officially at first, not through announcement, through reaction, because once the portrait becomes visible to the right people, it stops being a quiet internal adjustment and becomes an emotional fracture point. Camilla allegedly reacts instantly, sharply, almost physically, like someone has placed a mirror in front of a history she never wanted reactivated. Demands follow, fast, removal, meetings, clarifications, intervention. Every lever of influence she once relied on gets pulled in rapid succession. And then comes the shock that tightens the entire narrative. Nothing moves, no reversal, no emergency undoing, no institutional scrambling to soften the decision. Instead, there is resistance, not loud, not confrontational, but immovable. The kind of refusal that doesn't argue back, it simply doesn't comply. That's when the power dynamic reportedly shifts in a way she did not anticipate, because this is no longer about influence within a household, it becomes about structure, about who actually controls permanence inside the institution. And then Charles enters the center of the tension, because the version of him that Camilla expects, the protective, corrective, stabilizing force, does not appear in the way she needs. Instead, what she encounters is silence, not confusion, not hesitation, a deliberate lack of interference, a refusal to override what has already been set in motion. And that silence is interpreted in multiple ways depending on who is telling the story. Some say it's exhaustion after decades of emotional conflict. Some say it's acceptance of a new generational authority forming within the monarchy. Others say it is something colder, quiet acknowledgement that certain decisions are no longer his to reverse. But the most explosive reading inside palace gossip circles is simpler, he lets it stand. And that changes everything. Because once the central figure of authority does not intervene, the situation stops being reversible politics and becomes settled history. Meanwhile, Anne reappears in the narrative again, not as background presence, but as a symbolic counterweight. Her reported proximity to the placement of the portrait becomes a detail that spreads quickly through royal watch circles. Her alleged words, quiet but cutting, circulate in fragments, each one sharpening the perception that this was not just restoration but correction. And then the deeper layer surfaces. The past does not stay buried politely. It rises in pieces. Old relationships, old fractures, old emotional entanglements that never fully dissolved, only changed form over time. The narrative around Camilla's history with Andrew Parker Bowles resurfaces again in whispers, not as scandal in itself, but as emotional residue still affecting how certain members of the royal circle interpret loyalty, betrayal, and timing. Everything begins stacking. One memory on top of another, one grievance aligned against another, until it stops looking like isolated events and starts resembling a long, slow accumulation, finally reaching tipping point. And in the center of all of it stands William. No public spectacle, no emotional breakdown, no visible triumph, just controlled continuation. According to insiders, what defines him is not reaction, but structure. Every step aligned with process, every move aligned with permanence. Nothing impulsive, nothing easily reversible. And that is what makes it unsettling to those watching closely, because this doesn't feel like a moment. It feels like a phase that has already been completed before most people realized it began. The restoration of the portrait becomes more than placement. It becomes signal, a shift in internal narrative, a recalibration of memory inside an institution that is famously slow to adjust but devastatingly permanent once it does. And once Camilla fully grasps that permanence, the reaction is no longer just frustration, it becomes realization. Not just that something has been placed on the wall, but that something else has been quietly removed from influence. And the most unsettling part of all of it, the system does not bend back. It settles. And once it settles, it spreads outward into patronages, into visibility, into narrative weight, into who is spoken of and how often and with what tone. Names begin reappearing in official contexts that had been minimized for years. Others begin fading from prominence in ways that are subtle but unmistakable to those who know how to read royal signaling. And somewhere in all of this, Diana's presence, long absent in physical space, becomes increasingly present in symbolic space, not through speeches, not through public statements, but through positioning, through emphasis, through quiet institutional reminders that refuse to disappear again. And that is where the story refuses to close cleanly. Because what happened inside Windsor Castle is no longer just about a portrait on a wall. It is about what happens when memory is no longer passive and starts being actively restored by those who have waited long enough to control how history is arranged. And as of now, according to the whispers echoing through every layered corridor of royal gossip, the most unsettling truth is this: nothing about that placement feels temporary anymore.